Okay, so this lesson is on triangle congruence proofs. We're going to use the triangle congruence theorems that we talked about in class today and that you read about last night to show that two triangles are congruent. Now, if you remember, we talked about 4 different triangle congruence theorem. We talked about the side, 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 which means that corresponding sides of two triangles are congruent. We talked about side, angle, side, which means the side angle side is congruent to another side angle side. We talked about angle side angle, and we also talked about angle angle side. And we're going to use these in our proofs so that we can show if triangles are congruent or not. Whenever we do one of these, the first thing we're going to have to do is, if there's not already a diagram provided, we are going to create one, and we're also going to go ahead and look at the diagram, and we're going to figure out everything that we know by looking at the diagram before we even look at the proof to see what they want us to do. So let's start with this one. We actually looked at this diagram on Monday whenever we had all of the diagrams up, and you were able to tell me several different things about this diagram. We know that AB is parallel to XY, so we know that this segment here is parallel to this segment. We know that AX cuts BY in half because AX is the bisector of BY. So we talked about several things on Monday that we could tell just from this diagram. One of the first things we talked about was the vertical angles, that angle APB would be congruent to angle XPY because they're vertical angles directly across from each other. So that's one thing that we know we can use. A second thing that we know that we can use, because these two lines are parallel, is we can use the parallel lines theorem and talking about alternate interior angles. And that gives us that angle Y is congruent to angle B. It also gives us that angle A is congruent to angle X. So now that we have all of those things that we know about that diagram, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to decide which one of the triangle congruence proofs we're going to use. The first one we talked about was side, side, side. If you look at this diagram, you can clearly see that we only have one side in each triangle, so that means side, side, side is not a really good choice. The second one we had was side, angle, side. And again, we only have one side, so side, angle, side isn't going to work. We do have two angles, and there are two congruence theorems that use two angles. There's angle, angle, side, and then there's angle, side, angle. So we just need to look at the diagram, and we need to decide which one would be the better one to use. I think that since we have angle, side, angle here, and then we also have angle, side, angle up here, I think that the angle, side, angle one is going to be the better one for us to use in this proof. So now that we know all of this, let's go ahead and write the proof. It should be fairly easy now that we already have all this information. So going to the next slide. All right, so here's our proof. We talked about our vertical angles. So I stated that those two are congruent because they're vertical. We talked about our alternate interior angles. Now notice I only use this one and this one because I didn't need to use these other two to prove angle, side, angle. And then I also used definition of bisector to say that BP and YP are the same length. Definition of bisector. So now I have angle, side, angle, and I've proven that triangle ABP is congruent to angle XYP. Okay, so let's look at another one. This one's a little bit different because you notice down here they don't ask us to prove the triangles are congruent, but they ask us to prove that an angle is congruent. But to prove the angle is congruent, what we're going to do first is we're going to start by making the triangles congruent. So we're going to start out trying to make triangle AOB congruent to triangle COD. And then after we do that, we'll use corresponding parts of congruent figures to pull off angle AOB and angle COD and say that they are congruent. Now this is another diagram that we looked at before, and whenever we looked at this one on Monday, we talked about the radii being congruent. We actually found two sets of radii that we said were congruent. We said that OA is congruent to OC. So we had those two short ones. And then we also said that OD would be congruent to OB. So we have two different sets of radii. Now if you notice in our given, they tell us that BA is congruent to DC. So if we look at what we have here, by radii, we know that this is congruent to this, and we also know that this long one right here is congruent to this long one right here. So if you notice what we have, if we think about the congruence theorems, our first one we think of is side, 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 and in this case side, side, side fits because they give me these two sides and then I know by radii the other two sides. So this one I'm going to use side, side, side on. So here we go. Here's the proof. We have two circles that have a center of O. We said that the two short ones were congruent, and I'd use definition of circle there. We said that the two long ones are congruent, and again, that's the definition of the circle. Then they go back and they pull out part of the given. So now I have side, side, side. So I can say that those two triangles are congruent because of the side, side, side congruence theorem. Now if you remember, it didn't ask me to prove the triangles are congruent, it asked me to prove the angles are congruent. So once I know the sides are congruent, or the triangles are congruent, I can pull off the angle that I need and use the corresponding parts of congruent figures theorem. So since angle AOB corresponds to angle COD, and the two triangles are congruent, these congruent figures make these corresponding parts congruent. So that's the second proof. I'm not really going to ask you to write proofs tonight, but I am going to ask you to look at three questions on page 397. Question 5 and 6, where you have to look at one of the proofs in the textbook and see how you could change the proof a little bit. And then question number 8, which is another proof that you just need to fill in the blanks. So that's what I'm going to ask you to do and have ready for class tomorrow. Remember, you should have your notes and these three questions.